A Bargain in Black Crepe. Chapter 1. The Terms. The solicitor had the decency to look uncomfortable. Mr. Silas Greaves had been managing the Hargrove estate affairs for 11 years, which meant he had sat in this drawing-room during the late Baron Hargrove's prolonged decline, during the reading of a will that had surprised everyone, including, apparently, itself, and during the subsequent 18 months in which Lady Cecily Hargrove had quietly, methodically, and with perfect courtesy dismantled every assumption her late husband's family held about what would happen to his fortune when he died. He was here today, Cecily understood, because she had asked him to come. And she had asked him to come because she was about to propose something that would either save her from the Hargrove brothers' legal campaign or hand them the very weapon they required to destroy her. "Lord Pembroke has agreed to meet," Greaves said, laying a single card on the table between them with the careful movements of a man diffusing ordnance. Cecily looked at the card. Aldrich Pembroke, Viscount Pembroke. The title was new, inherited 3 months ago from a cousin he had never expected to outlive. And the ink was still, she noticed, very black, as though the printer had been emphatic about it. "His circumstances," she said. Not a question. She already knew his circumstances. She had known them before she instructed Greaves to make the initial inquiry, because Cecily Hargrove had learned, in 4 years of marriage to a man who believed charm was a substitute for honesty, to know everything before she walked into a room. Greaves shifted. "The Pembroke estate carries significant debt. The previous Viscount was not prudent. The farms are sound and the land is good, but the mortgages are considerable, and there are tenants whose welfare his lordship is apparently quite concerned." "The tenants," Cecily said. This was the detail that had decided her. Any man could be desperate. A desperate man who was also specifically worried about his tenants was a different proposition. "How many?" 62 households, my lady, including a mill that has provided employment to the village for 3 generations. He paused. "Without capital, it closes within the year." Cecily folded her hands in her lap. She was wearing, as she had every day for the past 18 months, black, deep, correct, mourning black, though what she mourned was considerably more complicated than the man himself. She mourned the 4 years she had spent being managed. She mourned the version of herself who had walked into a marriage at 19, believing that a handsome baron's attentiveness was a reliable indicator of his character. She mourned, most practically, the legal situation she now found herself in. A childless widow with a substantial fortune that her husband's brothers had decided, with the creative confidence of men who had never been told no, was rightfully theirs. She needed a titled husband. Not for love. She had revised her position on love with the thoroughness of a woman who had learned what its counterfeits cost, but for the legal shelter a marriage would provide. The Hargrove brothers could contest a widow's independent control of her dowry fortune. They could not contest a viscountess's. "Send Lord Pembroke my availability," she said. "Thursday at 2. He arrived precisely at 2, which she noted without comment, but not without appreciation. Late men had always seemed to her to be performing a carelessness they thought was power. Punctuality, by contrast, required no performance at all. Viscount Pembroke was, she catalogued him as she would catalogue any significant fact, taller than she had expected from his correspondence, and younger looking, though she knew him to be 31. He had a broad-shouldered, slightly weather-worn quality that suggested he spent more time on the estate than in town, and he carried his new title the way a man carries an unfamiliar coat. Correctly, but with occasional awareness of its weight. His expression, when her butler showed him in, was that of a man who had decided to be honest and was not entirely sure where that decision would take him. She approved of that too. "Lady Hargrove." He bowed, not excessively. "Lord Pembroke, please sit." She gestured to the chair across the low table on which tea had been arranged. She poured. It gave her hands occupation and established the domestic register she intended to move them directly out of. I have asked you here because I believe we may be of considerable use to each other. I propose to be entirely frank, and I would be grateful if you would extend the same courtesy." He settled into the chair with the careful arrangement of a large man in a not very large chair. "I am generally easier with frankness than with its alternatives," he said, and there was something in the straightforwardness of it, the absence of social gloss, that she found cautiously useful. "Then I will begin." She set down the teapot. "My situation is as follows. My late husband's brothers are contesting my management of my own fortune, a fortune that was, I note, entirely my own before the marriage, brought by me to the estate and not significantly supplemented by the Hargrove coffers. Their legal grounds are weak, but legal battles are expensive and prolonged, and I have been advised that a remarriage would end the matter entirely. The law being," she said this with a precise absence of emotion, "what it is." "Yes," said Pembroke. "Not I'm sorry, or how dreadful. Just acknowledgement, clean and accurate." "Your situation is also known to me," she continued. "The estate debt, the tenants, the mill. I have the capital to address all of it, substantially, and with funds to spare. What I do not have, in the eyes of the law, is the security of a married woman whose husband has agreed not to touch her fortune." She met his eyes. They were grey, and they were paying careful attention. "I am proposing a contract, a legal marriage with a precise financial settlement that protects my capital absolutely. No access, no control, no decision without my signature. You receive what you require for the estate and the tenants. I receive legal shelter and freedom from the Hargroves. We would conduct ourselves as separately as we choose." The room was very quiet. Outside, a carriage passed in the street. "Separate wings," he said, which was not what she expected first. "If you prefer." "I was going to say that I would prefer them. For your comfort." He looked at the table, then back at her. "I want to be clear that I understand what you are offering, and that I am not. That this would not be. I would not use the marriage as a means of overriding the settlement." Cecily looked at him steadily. "Many men would." "Yes," he said. "I know." A pause, and then something unexpected. "I would like to propose an addition to your terms." She kept her expression neutral. "Go on." "The settlement protects your fortune. I accept that entirely. But I would like to add a clause requiring my written agreement before any decisions are made about the Pembroke tenants and estate, not to give me authority over your capital, but to ensure that whatever funds are applied where they are most needed and in the manner most useful." He said it with care, as though he had thought about it on the way over. "I know this land. I know these people. I can tell you exactly which mortgage to clear first, which drainage will save the most fields, what the mill needs. I am not asking for control. I am asking to be consulted." Cecily was silent for a moment that she did not allow to extend too long, because prolonged silences encouraged men to interpret them as doubt, and this was not doubt. It was the recalibration of an expectation. She had not expected him to ask for something reasonable. "That clause," she said, "is acceptable." They shook hands across the low table, and the tea went cold, and outside the autumn light shifted over the London street, and Lady Cecily Hargrove thought, "Well, let us see." Chapter 2. The House. Pembroke Hall had, in better days, been handsome. You could still see it, in the proportions of the limestone facade, in the long windows of the west wing that caught the afternoon light and held it, in the kitchen gardens that someone had kept producing, even when everything else had been allowed to slip. A house that had been loved, Cecily thought, by someone who was no longer here to love it. She arrived on a November afternoon, 3 weeks after the quiet wedding at her solicitor's office, which they had both agreed should involve no guests, no breakfast, and a minimum of ceremony. Aldrich, she was attempting to think of him as Aldrich, which was not yet natural, had met her carriage in the drive and handed her down himself, with the unpretentious practicality she had observed in his London drawing room. He had dismissed the footman who appeared to perform this function. She was not certain whether this was consideration or efficiency, and had decided it was probably both. "The East Wing," he said, carrying her smallest case himself, while the coachman and a young footman managed the rest, "has been prepared. There is a sitting room and a small study. I asked Mrs. Hewitt to arrange the study with a writing desk, but if you'd prefer a different arrangement—" "I will review it this afternoon," she said, efficient herself. He nodded, and they went in. The house on the inside told the same story as its exterior, the bones of something fine and the evidence of years in which maintenance had been deferred because there was nothing to defer with. The carpets were worn to transparency in places. Several doors had been closed, rooms kept cold to save fuel. The remaining rooms, however, were clean and warm and smelled of beeswax and the plain good sense of a housekeeper who was doing the best she could. Mrs. Hewitt herself was waiting in the hall, 60, steady, and possessed of the expression of a woman who has served a house through crisis and has not left because leaving would have felt like conceding defeat. She curtsied to Cecily with a frankness in her assessment that was neither warm nor hostile, simply thorough. "My lady," she said, "I'll show you to the East Wing if you're ready." "Thank you, Mrs. Hewitt." Cecily followed her and was aware without looking back of Aldrich watching them go. She could not have said how she knew he was watching. She had been accurate about such things, in her experience, since her marriage had taught her to be. The accounts were in better order than she had expected. This was the first significant surprise. She had anticipated something managed with the rough economies of a desperate man, entries crossed out, columns that didn't resolve, the financial equivalent of a held breath. Instead, the Pembroke ledgers were methodical, even elegant. Every expenditure itemized, every debt recorded precisely, and, most unexpectedly, notations beside each entry in a small, even hand that explained the reasoning. Mill repairs deferred, roof sound until spring, immediate capital directed to seed purchase for home farm. Beside a crossed-out entry, furniture sale cancelled, Mrs. Hewitt's assessment that the table is structural to the dining room was correct. Cecily sat in her new study on the second morning, the ledgers open before her, and read these notes the way she might read a letter, for the character of the person who had written them. She had married men on legal documents before. Her first marriage had been contracts and courtesy and the social performance of affection, and what lay beneath had taken 4 years to fully reveal itself. She was not naive enough to believe that a man who kept careful accounts was necessarily a man of integrity, but the notations were specific. They suggested a person paying attention, the kind of attention you paid to things you considered your responsibility. There was a knock at the study door. "Come in." Aldrich entered with the slight self-consciousness of a man entering a room that has recently become someone else's domain. He had come from outside. She could see it in the mud on his boots and the November colour in his face. And he was carrying a folded paper that he set on the desk with a care that suggested it was important. "The mill accounts," he said, "separately kept. I thought you'd want to see them alongside the main ledgers. The foreman has also written a summary of what the repairs would cost and how long they'd take." Cecily looked at the paper, then at him. "You asked the foreman to prepare a written summary." "I thought it would be more useful than my paraphrase of a conversation." He said it without particular emphasis, as if this was simply what one did. "I can also take you to see it, if you'd find that useful. The mill. Tuesday would be good. Hartley, the foreman, is there all day Tuesdays." She had not expected to be consulted. Not truly. She had written the consultation clause into the contract because it was reasonable and because she had decided to be reasonable, but she had expected it to function as most such clauses in her experience had functioned, as an aspiration, honoured approximately. She had not expected him to appear at her study door in muddy boots with a foreman's written summary. "Tuesday," she said. Yes, I would like that. He nodded, preparing to leave, and she said, because she was not a woman who allowed important observations to go unrecorded, the notes in the main ledger, beside the entries. He paused. They're very precise, she said. The reasoning is clear. He looked at her with the careful attention she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. I didn't want whoever came after, whoever had to manage this, to have to guess at the thinking, he said. I wanted them to be able to see the decisions as decisions, not just the results. Whoever came after, not you, not a wife. The notes had been written, she understood, before he knew who would read them, written for any person who might need to understand, out of a straightforward conviction that a person managing an estate deserved to understand it fully. This revised several of her calculations. She said only, "Thank you for the mill accounts," and turned back to the ledger. But she was aware, as the door closed, that her opinion of this arrangement had shifted in a direction she had not anticipated, and she spent several minutes deciding how she felt about that before returning to the columns. Chapter 3. The Brothers. The letter arrived in December, or rather, the letter arrived first, and the brothers arrived 3 days after it, having apparently not considered that the letter might require a response before they presented themselves. Cecily was in the kitchen garden with Mrs. Hewitt, reviewing the forcing beds, when she was told that Mr. Benedict Hargrove and Mr. Caspar Hargrove had called and were waiting in the morning room. She thanked Mrs. Hewitt, removed her gardening gloves at a pace that conveyed nothing in particular, and went in. Benedict was the elder, 50, heavy-set, with the specific look of a man who has always believed his own conclusions. Caspar was sharper, younger, more watchful, the one, Cecily had always thought, who supplied the tactical intelligence for the partnership while Benedict supplied the conviction. They stood as she entered. She did not invite them to sit. "Lady Hargrove," Benedict began, with the particular emphasis of a man using a widow's title to remind her of her dependency. He had apparently not yet processed that the title had changed. Or, "I understand congratulations may be in order." "Lady Pembroke?" Cecily said pleasantly. "Thank you, yes." A flicker in Caspar's expression. Recalculation. "We had hoped, that is, we were not informed of the intention to remarry. I was not aware I required your notification." "Naturally not," Caspar recovering. "We have come merely out of fraternal concern. Our brother's wife, our sister, in spirit." "Mr. Hargrove," Cecily said, in the tone she reserved for conversations whose pretense she was terminating. "Your brother and I had a civil marriage and a business-like relationship. You were not fraternal to me during his lifetime, and I would prefer we did not construct a retrospective warmth now that you find it convenient. You have come because the remarriage complicates your legal case. I understand that. You may tell your solicitors that the case will be withdrawn, or you may continue it at your own considerable expense against a Viscountess whose husband—" And here the door opened, because she had sent a message to Aldrich when she removed her gardening gloves, "is, I believe, arrived." Aldrich entered. He had, she noted, changed his coat. He stood beside her with the uncomplicated solidity of a man who has done this specific thing, stood next to someone who needed standing next to, and addressed the brothers with a courtesy that was neither warm nor threatening, simply immovable. "Gentlemen," he said, "I hope your journey from London was comfortable." Benedict stared at him. Caspar performed a rapid series of social recalibrations. They stayed for 20 minutes, during which they consumed tea with diminishing appetite and extracted themselves by degrees from their previously stated positions, and they were civil throughout, in the way of men who have assessed an obstacle and are deciding whether to rout around it or retreat. When they left, Cecily closed the morning room door and stood for a moment with her back to it. "The solicitors will receive a withdrawal within the fortnight," she said, Casper is the practical one. He'll calculate the odds and advise Benedict to stand down. I thought as much. She turned. He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, a posture she had learned was characteristic, the posture of a man comfortable in his own presence, who was also at this moment watching her with an expression she had not yet satisfactorily catalogued. "You changed your coat," she said. "You sent the message with some urgency." He said it simply. "I thought it seemed like a moment where—" He paused. "I wanted to be useful." Cecily looked at him for a moment. She had spent 4 years with a man who had wanted, in every room he entered, to be admired. She had spent 4 more years on her own, being very careful about the difference between what people said and what they meant. "You were," she said. And then, before she entirely decided to say it, "Thank you, Aldrich." He looked at her, the careful attention, the grey eyes, and something in his face did what faces do when they receive the thing they have been hoping for without quite admitting it. He nodded, quietly. "Of course." The fire in the morning room was burning low. Outside, the December garden was bare and pale under a flat sky, and the house was quiet in the way of a house that has let out a long breath. They had supper together that evening. They had fallen into the habit of supper together, not from the contract, but from the natural gravity of 2 people in a house who found they had things to say at the end of the day. It had begun with practical matters, the drainage report, the mill visit, a question about whether the east-facing bedroom in the north wing warranted repair, and had extended, in the way of practical matters between people who are paying attention, into less practical ones. She had told him, over the mill visit tea that Hartley's wife had produced in the mill cottage, about her first marriage. Not in detail, not as complaint, but in the plain, factual account of a woman who considered honesty a form of respect. She had watched Aldrich listen, genuinely listen, without the reflexive reassurances men so often offered as a substitute, and had revised again her expectations. He had told her, on the drive back through the November fields, about the tenants, by name, history, particular circumstance. The Greenwells in the South Cottage who had lost a son at Waterloo and whose elder daughter had shown aptitude for figures that he'd been trying to find a useful direction for. The Hartley grandchildren who had never owned new boots. He had said all of this in the matter-of-fact manner of a man reporting on his responsibilities, and she had heard beneath it, clearly, the particular ache of a person who cares for people he cannot yet adequately provide for. She had authorized the first capital transfer that afternoon. Now, over supper, he set down his fork and said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. When Greaves first approached me about this arrangement, my first response was relief, which I'm not proud of. Relief that the problem would be solved. He looked at the table, then at her. "I thought of you as a solution. I want to be honest about that, because you have been honest with me about everything. And because I think you would know if I was concealing it, and because the relief lasted approximately until I met you, and then it became considerably more complicated." The candles on the supper table were burning steadily. Outside, the December evening pressed against the windows. "Why complicated?" Cecily said carefully. "Because a solution does not," he said. "Keep a careful account of your footsteps in the morning so she knows where you are before she sees you. A solution does not leave the ledger room door open." He paused. "I have been trying not to make you uncomfortable. I don't entirely know the right distance." Cecily looked at him, really looked at him, with the full attention she gave to things that required it. She had been keeping her own accounts. She knew what was in them. "The right distance," she said slowly, "is not fixed. It is negotiable, as circumstances develop." She held his gaze. "I would like to negotiate it, in time." The careful attention in his expression shifted into something warmer and more unguarded, and he said nothing, because he was a man who understood when things had been said that were sufficient, and they finished supper, and the house was quiet around them, and the distance between them had moved. Chapter 4. The new contract. Spring came to the Pembroke estate with the quality of proof. The mill roof had been repaired in February, and by March the sound of it running carried across the south fields on the right wind, a steady, purposeful rhythm that Aldrich said was the best sound the village had made in 4 years. The drainage work in the east fields had begun as soon as the frost cleared, and the home farm had gone into spring with new seed and repaired fences and a particular air of agricultural confidence. Mrs. Hewitt had supervised the reopening of 3 previously closed rooms, the replacement of the dining room carpet, and the repair of the east wing staircase, each in turn, as the accounts permitted, with the systematic satisfaction of a woman checking items off a very long list. Cecily had watched all of it. She had not merely observed. She had participated, in the manner of a woman who had managed her own affairs for 4 years and was not prepared to cease doing so. She had sat with Hartley, the mill foreman, and reviewed the repair costings line by line. She had attended the drainage planning meeting with the land agent and asked questions that the land agent had not expected and had answered thoroughly and with increasing respect. She had taken tea in the south cottage with Mrs. Greenwell and had inquired about the daughter with the aptitude for figures and had come home with a proposal that she and Aldrich had discussed over supper and actioned within the week. The daughter, Nell Greenwell, was now apprenticed to Greaves's Bath office, where she was apparently performing with a precision that Greaves had described in his letter as striking. Cecily had read this letter at breakfast. Aldrich had read it over her shoulder. They had moved by degrees and without formal declaration, from separate wings to shared mornings, from shared mornings to the particular easy geography of 2 people who know the other's habits and have stopped finding them surprising. She had his muddy boots version, and his coat changed for important moments version, and the version that appeared at 7 o'clock with the estate correspondence, and the particular set of his mouth that meant the night had not been entirely restful. He had her morning precision, and her ledger room silences, and the voice she used for conversations she was terminating, and the different, quieter voice she used on the evenings when she allowed things to be less armoured. He had never commented on the distinction, which was how she knew he had noticed it. They had not revisited the December supper conversation directly. They had revisited it in every other way, in the gradual closing of distance, in the decisions made together without requiring the contract's consultation clause, because consulting had become simply the way they operated, in the evenings that extended past necessity into the comfortable territory of 2 people who are choosing to be in the same room. But they had not named it. Cecily had found this appropriate. Not avoidance, but pace, the correct pace for 2 people building something that would need to be sound. The legal withdrawal from the Hargrove brothers arrived in March, as predicted. Caspar had calculated the odds. The letter was brief and constructed in the language of gracious retreat, which Cecily read once and set aside, and then retrieved and read again because she wanted to be certain she felt what she thought she felt, which was finished. Not triumph, not relief, exactly. Simply the quiet, clean sensation of a door closed on a room she would not need to enter again. She was in the garden when she finished reading it. The kitchen garden, which had become her particular domain, where she had spent the winter learning from Mrs. Hewitt which things wanted warmth and which things wanted leaving alone, a lesson that seemed broadly applicable. She folded the letter and looked at the forcing beds, which were beginning, in the pale April way of things, to suggest themselves. The letter from the solicitors, Aldrich said, from the garden gate. She turned. He had come from the mill, she could see, the foreman's visit day. He was windswept and slightly muddy, and entirely himself. She held up the letter. "They've withdrawn," she said. He looked at her. Not at the letter, at her. "Are you all right?" This was the question. Not good news, then, or I told you Caspar would calculate it, which were both things he might accurately have said. But the prior question, the more important one. She had married a man who had never once asked that question, because his first assumption had always been about outcomes rather than people. "Yes," she said, and found it was entirely true. I am very well. He came into the garden, closing the gate behind him, and stood beside her at the forcing beds in the April morning. He did not take her hand or make a speech. This was, she had learned, how he was, present rather than performative. She had come to value presence considerably more than performance. I have been thinking, she said, about the contract. A pause. Oh? The original contract, the terms we agreed in November. She looked at the beds, where the first green suggestions were beginning. I would like to revise it. He was still beside her. The clause about separate management of my capital was necessary then, she said. I needed it to be explicit because I needed to be certain. You understand that? Entirely, he said. No qualification. What I have found, she considered the word, over the past 4 months is that the explicit clause has never been required. The protection was in the document, but the actual management has been a collaboration, which was not what I designed. No, he agreed quietly. I designed a transaction with protective clauses. I appear to have built something else. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the full, unhurried attention he brought to things that mattered, and his expression was open in a way she had come to associate with the mornings when he was most himself. I would like to write a new contract, not a legal one, an understanding. What would the terms be? He asked, as she would have asked, as they had both learned to ask. Mutual, equal decision-making on the estate, my capital, my signature, my authority, undiminished. She held his gaze. And something not in the original agreement. Tell me. That this is a marriage, she said, not a transaction, that the person I have spent 4 months finding you to be is the person I am. Choosing. The word was precise, and she had chosen it precisely. Not for legal shelter, not because it is convenient, because I have been very careful about the evidence, and the evidence is considerable. Aldrich looked at her in the April garden, the mill sound carrying faintly across the fields, the forcing beds suggesting themselves at their feet, and the particular quality of his expression, the warmth she had seen first in December and had been cataloguing with increasing private honesty ever since, was entirely unguarded. I have been choosing since October, he said. I was simply waiting to be sure you knew. She looked at him for a moment, the clean, bright April morning around them. I know, she said. He took her hand, not with the ceremony of a declaration, not with any performance at all, but with the straightforward intention of a man closing a distance he had been keeping at her pace and was now invited to close. She let him, and they stood in the kitchen garden of the house that was, she understood now, hers in a way that had nothing to do with contracts, hers because she had chosen it, as she was choosing this. She wrote the new understanding that evening, at her desk, in the clean, clear hand she used for important documents. It was 2 pages long. The financial terms were unchanged, her capital, her authority, her name on every ledger. The new terms took up the 2nd page, shared management of the estate, shared decisions about the people in their care, the mutual expectation of honesty that they had been practicing since November and were now simply recording. At the bottom, she added a final clause that was not legal language and did not pretend to be. It is further agreed between the parties that this arrangement, having commenced as a matter of mutual practical necessity, has become a matter of mutual choice, and that choice being freely made on both sides and with full knowledge of the other's character, it is the intention of both parties to honour it, not as a contract, but as a marriage, in the complete meaning of that word. She brought it to the library, where Aldrich was reviewing the spring farm reports by the fire, and set it on the table beside him. He read it carefully, as he read everything. When he reached the final clause, he was still for a moment. Then he took the pen from the desk and signed his name below hers, and looked up. I would add 1 term, he said. She raised an eyebrow. That we do not burn the original contract. He set down the pen. I would like to keep it. To remember what this was before it became what it is. Cecily looked at him. The muddy boots and the careful eyes, and the man who had written notes in ledger margins for a stranger to read, and felt something settle in her that had been held in suspension since before the bargain was struck, since the 4 years before that, since the 19-year-old she had once been had walked into a drawing room believing that attention was the same thing as care. Done, she said. She sat in the chair across the fire from him, and the house was alive around them, the mill sound gone quiet for the night, the estate at rest, 62 households in their cottages under the April sky. And she thought, this is what it is, not performance, not protection. This. Outside, the forcing beds were doing what they were designed to do, turning, quietly and without spectacle, toward the light. The Pembroke estate was, by the following year, considered among the best-managed properties in Somerset. The mill employed 14 families. Nell Greenwell had been promoted at Greaves's office and was reputed to be more efficient than Greaves himself, which Greaves reported with an admiration he appeared not to notice he was expressing. The Hargroves did not call again. Lady Pembroke, who had arrived with trunks and a settlement agreement and had, over the course of 4 months, made the house into the kind of home it had only previously been in better days, was observed by the village to be in the kitchen garden most mornings, and on the estate business most afternoons, and in the library most evenings with her husband, which was, the village agreed, exactly as it should be. Lord Pembroke was observed to be a man who had stopped looking like a man carrying an unfamiliar coat. He had grown into the title the way a person grows into a life that fits them, not noticing it exactly, because the fit was good, and good fits do not demand attention. They were, in the village's considered opinion, the kind of people the house had been waiting for. The house, given sufficient evidence, agreed. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and